Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Daniel Vecchio. We've had Daniel on 2 times before. It was on the issue of the Trinity and the ontological argument. And then this time we're going to talk about the papacy again, or actually a new argument that I don't think is very well known. And Daniel is going to explain what exactly this argument is. We're going to kind of have a back and forth and develop it more. So Daniel, I've had you on the show before. Can you tell me something interesting that's going on in your life right now?
I'm in lockdown, right? I'm out in California, so the quarantine's in effect. The hospitals are full to capacity, so there's not too much interesting going on other than I've got 2 kids running around. One's crawling around, the other's running around. My youngest Bruno and my older daughter Vivian, and so they keep me busy when I'm not teaching and doing research and things of that nature.
Have you found yourself more productive during lockdown or just about the same?
Well, I teach now online exclusively, as many other professors do. And I find that teaching online, if you do it appropriately and correctly, takes much more time than actually going in to deliver a lecture, because you just kind of, if you know the material, you can kind of have a basic outline of what you're going to teach, so you just walk in, you deliver your lecture, and field questions generate discussion. But when it's online, it really takes more time to involve the students. It takes more time to interact with them. I find grading material online takes more time for some reason than just having paper. Where you jot down, clarify or see me. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But it just takes more time. So I don't have a lot of free time myself. I just been super busy this semester. We have 1 week left as this is being recorded. So I'm about to get a huge batch of work, and then I'll disappear and reemerge. It will be Christmas, and then I'll go back under again, and then I'll reemerge, and it'll be New Year's, and then I'm teaching in the winter session. So I'm prepping for that too, because the course that I haven't taught online in a long time. So I really have to kind of redo the whole course.
Yeah. All right, well, that sounds great, Daniel. Let's now get into the argument that you've been developing. So I have the document that you send me. Do you mind if I share my screen and we can look at it together?
Yeah, go ahead and share. Yeah, I just threw this together. Not that it's sloppy. I hope it's not sloppy. Just to kind of guide the discussion. And I call it the Caiaphas Theory, though it's really the Caiaphas Theory.
Yeah.
It's the connection of the sort of 2 names. And what I want to say, you said this is sort of new. What I would say is it's just not very prominent in argument. And I have some theories as to why it's not very prominent. But the basic, well, I'll read the thesis that I have. Yeah. My aim is to piece together a new perspective on Simon's name change and focus specifically on the significance such a name would have had for the apostles and early disciples. In particular, I argue that Simon Peter's name represents his role as a high priest and overseer of the apostles. For Simon Peter's name in Aramaic was Caiaphas. The name is transliterated from Greek, Cephas, back into Aramaic, right? So the New Testament writers were writing in Greek, recording the Aramaic name, right? And commonly thought to be spelled that way. That's the modern Hebrew script, right? So I'm not a Hebraist or an expert on Aramaic. So this is sort of a deficiency for me that I'm working on. I want to work with other scholars who are proficient in this area. But you know that Hebrews read right to left rather than left to right. So you want to pay attention to the first letter there, which is slightly different than it will appear down here with Caiaphas. I believe that's a kaf versus a quod. So there's slightly different letters. You see one's kind of got that bend to it and the other looks like a backwards C. So that's in the modern script. I argue that Caiaphas is a variant of the name Caiaphas, which is spelled in the modern script that way. Both names are exceedingly uncommon for their time and place. In fact, if you look at, there's been some studies that trying to find examples of these names, and there just isn't a lot. There is an ossuary that was discovered that's believed to be the family ossuary of Caiaphas. And so that's really one instance where we have the name recorded of Caiaphas. As for Caiaphas, the only other instance that anyone's been able to find, I think it's a Jesuit priest. His name is, I think it's Fitzmyer, maybe. It'll be in the sources below, I think. Maybe not, but they found a possible instance of the name from the 4th century BC in Egypt, a possible of Caiaphas as a name. So it's really an uncommon name for its time and place. Given that the two names are twin variants and exceedingly rare, if not unique in the first century Judea, we should take the renaming of Simon Bar-Jonah as Caiaphas as a significant piece of evidence that he was being elevated by Christ into the role of a kind of chief priest among the apostles, or a bishop overseer of the apostles. I look at the linguistic, exegetical, and patristic evidence to support an abductive argument that Simon Caiaphas and Joseph ben Caiaphas are related as type-antitype. So you know about type-antitype relationships or typology, where you see an instance of something. And what's a good example of a type? Maybe the ark of Noah and the church, right? Sometimes seen, or the Exodus going through the Red Sea is a type of baptism, right? And so what I'm arguing, and this isn't original to me, is that the apostles were a type of Sanhedrin, the new Sanhedrin, and the disciples. And if so, it would make sense that it is modeled roughly on a similar hierarchy. And indeed, we do see 70 disciples and 70 members of the Sanhedrin and so forth. So would there be like a chief, a head, a high priest? If so, who would that be? Well, a prime candidate would be Peter, or Simon Peter. And I think that this bit of evidence really not only supports the Catholic claim of Petrine supremacy, but also illuminates the scriptures in kind of interesting ways. When we look at this Caiaphas, Cephas or Caiaphas connection. So let me just bring up some of the stuff I have here just so I can read my sources as well.
Sure.
But,
are you going down to the biblical sources, or?
Yeah, so let me just give you a little background. How did this all start for me, or why I was interested in this? Last Palm Sunday, I think I don't remember if it was in Matthew, but we were reading about the trial, of course, the Passion Play, the trial of Jesus. And there's this interplay that occurs in Matthew between Peter and Caiaphas. And Jesus is brought to the house of Caiaphas and is put on trial. And Peter, Jesus is there being questioned by Caiaphas, and then Peter's lurking in the background, denying Christ. And I was listening to the priest talk about it and thinking, gee, Peter's name is in Aramaic is Cephas. And then I thought, well, that sounds a lot like Caiaphas to me in my ear. I wonder if there's any connection. Like, that was just a thought that occurred to me while I was in Mass. And so like a week later or so, I finally got around to like Googling it. And I started getting all these hits of researchers, of biblical exegetes and Orientalists who make this claim that the names are twinned. And then I see others who argue that there's a typological relationship between Caiaphas and Peter that's being made explicit in the scriptures. And I thought that was really interesting, but I hadn't really seen anyone put it all together. So I put it out there on Facebook a few times and got shot down by some friends. And, oh, that's weak evidence. So whenever somebody just says, oh, that's really bad evidence, my inclination is to keep digging. And so this is sort of the fruit of my digging and digging and digging. So I guess it's good to start with scripture. Of course, the famous passage in Matthew 16 through 19, every Catholic keeps that close to their heart and in their back pocket, right? Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So a couple of things, of course, we see that the gospel writer is already identifying him as Simon Peter, even before Christ proclaims this. Peter, of course, is a translation of the Aramaic Caiaphas. It's not a transliteration, but a literal, it's a name translation, right? So he's being called Petros, right? Rock. So we find, if you scroll down a little bit more on the document, go down to John. I think I have a reference to John on the next page. Yeah, you see in John 1:42, he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Caiaphas," which means Peter. So that is in the scriptures where Peter and Caiaphas are directly connected as meaning, right? A lot of people say there's an inconsistency or a contradiction here between John and Matthew because this is very early on and Matthew's much later. One thing is interesting is in John, it's in the future tense, you shall be, or you will be called Peter. It's not a direct, you are now called that, but it's sort of like you're going to receive this name.
That's actually a very nice detail, because oftentimes I've been led to think that John 1:42 like contradicts Matthew 16:18, because I thought or Matthew 16, that the passage where Peter gets his name change. But you're saying this is in the future tense, so Jesus says you will be called Peter, but then when Peter does his confession to Christ, that's when he is officially going from Simon to Peter. Okay, that's nice.
Yeah. So if you scroll back up for a second, back to the other, about 10 chapters later in Matthew, after the great confession of faith by which Jesus renamed Simon, we have that scene. It's a little bit lengthy, but I want to read it because this all sets up the argument, really. "Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that he might be put to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at least two came forward and said, 'This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent." So he didn't feel the need to respond right then, right? So that's interesting. "And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you, by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.'" Notice that, the living God. Remember in Matthew 16:16, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," right? And now, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." It's essentially the same sentence reworked from a creedal confession into a question. Jesus said to him, and this is odd, right? I've never understood this. "You have said so." So scroll down, but sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But so what you're doing is you're establishing a type anti-type relationship between Peter and Caiaphas.
Yes. What you see here is Peter's confession becomes the question by which Caiaphas condemns Christ, right?
Mm.
Peter, that by which he becomes Caiaphas is that by which Caiaphas condemns Christ.
Hmm.
But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So there he's quoting Daniel. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. This is really interesting. Caiaphas takes this to be blasphemy. Simon Peter makes this confession, right? So that's really interesting to me. And then the next point was intended to show there is a direct connection between Caiaphas and Peter made in Scripture. So we have no doubt that that's what it was intended to be. We also see Paul use this. He says, and he appeared to Caiaphas and then to the 12. And the significance here is this appears to be a reference to Simon Caiaphas. And in some Syriac manuscripts, this is interesting, Caiaphas is spelled identically to Caiaphas. And actually, I found this out by looking at the primary argument against the name variation. When we get down to the sources, the primary person who argues against the idea that these are name twins is Nestle. And he goes on to, he says, oh, they don't mean the same thing, they're spelled differently. And then he's talking about a few other things, and then he says that Caiaphas is spelled this way, and then he admits, it's spelled with that backwards C, the kaf, but then he admits, although there is a variation in a Syriac text of 1 Corinthians 15:5, where Caiaphas is spelled with a quote. And so I looked it up, and indeed, you can find it. You can find it in the Syriac manuscripts, and there it is there in Syriac script, which is a cousin of Aramaic. I mean, it's a variety of Aramaic.
Right. So it's closer to the original language.
Right. So really, the disciples, and Jesus spoke Galilean Aramaic or Chaldean Aramaic, right? So it's a very particular dialect of Aramaic. Syriac is basically the form of Aramaic, as I understand it, that started in southern Turkey, right, among Jewish communities there. So they're like very similar languages. So you would kind of expect that the Syriac texts, if there is any name connection, they'd be the ones that kind of pick up on this a little bit. And this is something that if any of your listeners have any knowledge of Syriac and Aramaic, I'd be very interested if you know the Syriac fathers, because this is where I really want to take the next step of my research. I only have a few sources right now, but they're kind of interesting that I want to mention. One is from Ephraim the Syrian, and I have the dates there of his life. So this is a 4th century figure. He composed many things, but among them were hymns. And one of the hymns contains this interesting juxtaposition between Simon Caiaphas, the unshakable rock, which he uses the same exact word, Caiaphas, and then he curses Caiaphas in the next passage in the Syriac, and the lettering is almost identical. Mm-hmm. There's just like a slight line difference between Caiaphas and Caiaphas. So I think that there's an intended linguistic pun going on, if you will, that's going on that Ephraim is aware of, playing off the two, right? Why would you play off one against the other? One is a symbol of the unshakable rock, and the other is sort of this cursed man, right? Who blasphemed, who accused Christ of being blasphemous, right? The next figure, St. Macarius the Egyptian, again, 4th century. here I found in homily 26, he notes a connection of Moses, Aaron as high priest, then jumps to Caiaphas, then to Peter, calling him the successor to Moses. Thus, Caiaphas and Cephas are both identified as high priests occupying the seat of Moses. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting connection, right? Not so much playing off the name similarities, but just seeing the case that Peter does occupy this high priest position, and he puts him right next to Caiaphas as sort of the last of the Jewish high priests, and then Peter would be the first of the new covenant. And then the last sort of early church source I have is Saint Isidore of Pelusium. It's the 5th century, a little bit later. Book 1, letter 57 to Cyrus makes a typological argument between Caiaphas and Peter using Matthew's gospel. Caiaphas is the quote unquote old wineskin who rents his vestment and bursts. The old wineskins burst, if you remember that parable, when hearing that Jesus is Messiah and Son of God. So here he's making the same typological connection that I'm making, right? What happens when Caiaphas hears the confession that Jesus is the Son of the living God? Bursts open, right? Rents his vestments. Peter is the new wineskins in which the revelation that Jesus is Messiah, the Son of the living God, is poured. Okay, so that's sort of what I have for, and I really think I have this intuition that if I could read or understand Syriac, the problem is there's just not a lot of translations out there. And the Greek fathers and Latin fathers, they're surprisingly poor when it comes to language arguments. I mean, for example, they think that Caiaphas might be connected to the Greek word for head, Cephalus. And so they're saying, well, Jesus is calling him head, like Cephalus. Well, that's like to transliterate from Aramaic into Greek and then translate the word, and that doesn't really work. So some of their language arguments, the Greek and Latin fathers, they're really not there, not spot on. But I really want to know what the Syriac fathers are saying. So hopefully somebody knows and can find out more. And I went and I kept looking, and I found some interesting Jewish sources. The Toldat Yeshu is an early medieval Jewish anti-Christian polemic. I think there are various dates, right, from the 9th to the 11th century on through the medieval era, which basically depicts Jesus as kind of a magician, right? And so this is sort of an anti-Christian text. And there, it's very interesting. Simon Peter crops up as a major figure in that text, but his name is clearly, and I've seen this, at least this is how Wagenseil spells it, and he was a Hebraist from 1681. So I was actually able to go back to editions that are that old. You can actually find them on Google, very old parchments of the Wagenseil edition. You can see it says in the Hebrew, Shimon Caiaphas, right, with the Hebrew script, the quote there. So he is Simon Caiaphas, and it's spelled that way. And it's very interesting to me that that the Jews would have made that name switch if they're completely different names, right? So that's just, I keep that in the background as a very interesting thing. And indeed, you can find in the Encyclopedia Judaica an entry on Peter ben Joseph that refers to Simon Peter as Simon Caiaphas. This is sort of a more modern entry, which may be an interesting confirmation of the way in which the name has been understood as a variation of the high priest name. Quote, it is interesting to note that Rabbi Tam accepts the medieval legend that Peter Simon Caiaphas was a devout Jew who sacrificed himself in order to effect the separation between Judaism and Christianity, and is the author of the prayer Nishmat, a legend whose authenticity has been rejected by Rabbi Tam's grandfather Rashi. Okay, so that's a little background stuff that we don't have to get into, but the interesting point is the Encyclopedia Judaica referencing this very I think he's like a 12th century rabbi. I could be wrong there. Just uses Simon Caiaphas pretty, as if it's just obvious that that's going to refer to Peter. Any questions so far? I'm throwing a lot at you. Just kind of here's what I found. This stuff is just kind of historical stuff that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
What we're going to move into is sort of the more scholarly case of some of the exegetical work that's been done.
Yeah, so I have quite a bit to say. Would you prefer that I do this when I make my comments at the end, or is it okay if I make them now, like just what I have so far?
Go for it. Let's
Yeah,
hear it.
sure. So let's just go back to the top really quick. So I think there's from what I've studied on the issue, there's a lot of good things in what you're saying, and I'm not terribly, let's say, dissuaded from your thesis, right? So I'm trying to be objective and not get too excited and say, oh, we got another argument, right? But this is pretty interesting. So I think the type anti-type relationship is very impressive, because I didn't notice that type anti-type relationship until you pointed it out to me. It's a very specific way in which the Gospel of Matthew portrays Peter and the apostles, or Peter and Caiaphas. But also, some people might dismiss this, but in Raymond Brown's commentary on the New Testament and introduction to the New Testament, he does talk about, and I got to get all my sources out. Okay, so he does talk about on page, where is it? Let's see, on page 187, where, let's see here, Peter is portrayed, so to speak, as a supreme rabbi, right? So there's that connection that's already made in Raymond Brown's work. I'm trying to find out actually what page it's actually on. It's around the section where he talks about, let's see here. Yeah, where he talks about like Peter receiving the keys to the kingdom. Oh, here we go. It's page 189, excuse me. So he says, there are debates about what is meant by binding and loosing. Is it the power to forgive, not forgive sins, as in John 20:23, or to teach what must be observed, with the result that Peter is the chief rabbi? Right. So binding and loosing in that passage is the rabbinic power to either bind some command or loose it. It gives the person the power to forgive sins. It gives the person the power to excommunicate someone who is not in keeping with temple law, to interpret the law, to make ex cathedra pronouncements in the name of the throne of Moses. There's a lot going on there. But yeah, I mean, so Raymond Brown recognizes this on page 189 of his work, An Introduction to the New Testament. But then also in the Orthodox scholar Edward, I hope I don't butcher his last name, Sienski, he says on page 73, for this reason, many scholars have argued that what was conferred upon Peter in this verse, 16:19, is essentially the office of supreme rabbi, who can promulgate binding rules and make authoritative decisions about teaching, in contrast to the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. What's interesting too is that in the preceding passage in Matthew 16, Christ talks about how the Pharisees have shut up heaven. And then in this passage, Peter is the one who will open the keys to has the keys to the kingdom of heaven, to open it up, so to speak, to allow, generally speaking, the Gentiles to enter into the kingdom. So there's clearly a type anti-type relationship, which other scholars who are not Catholic necessarily have recognized. And then let's see here. Let's see the source for this. So I can show you the source on page 73 of the Papacy and the Orthodox and Edward Sienski's work, but he lists out different scholars such as B.H. Streeter in the Four Gospels, Reinhard Hummel, it is some German text. Let's see here, William Davies and Dale Allison in a critical and exegetical commentary on the Gospel according to St. Matthew. The list goes on and on and on, right?
Sure,
but
yeah.
Sienski recognizes your argument and is saying many scholars agree that Peter was given a position of supreme rabbi. And then just to kind of sweeten the deal, right? Or actually, I can go on and on because I've looked into this. But in the book that I cite often by Roger David Oss on Simon Peter's denial and Jesus commissioning him as his successor, Oss talks about when Peter shows up into the temple or the court of the high priest, right? And he's saying that there's a type of typological connection being made there. But more importantly, in the Syriac Fathers, you mention how Peter receives the throne of Moses. He's the successor of Moses. So for the audience, the throne of Moses was the symbol of the legal authority to interpret the law of Moses. And whoever had the throne of Moses, according to Marcia Cohen and Herbert Basser in their book, The Gospel of Matthew and Judaic Traditions, the person who had that throne had the power, given the high council, if they ruled together, they could make an ex cathedra ruling from Moses Cathedras, the seat of Moses, that would demand the obedience of all the people. So they had that power to do that in Jewish tradition. And Roger David Oss, who is a Protestant Lutheran scholar, he makes the argument that Peter is a type, not only Peter is a type for Joshua, and in Jewish tradition, before Moses died, he gave his throne to Joshua. So hence Peter becomes the new Joshua. He receives the throne of Moses. Roger David Oss explicitly confirms this as a Protestant scholar. And one more point too. Sorry, I'm going on a bit, but when you
let me just interject one thing, because I wanted to fit this in before you move on.
Sure.
A lot of this binding and loosing goes back to Isaiah 22, and now I'm forgetting where I read this, and I feel bad that I didn't write it down.
No, you're
but
good.
One commentator mentioned that so Isaiah 22 is talking about Eliakim, who is the steward of King Hezekiah, right, and who is of the line of David, and who is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So all of these Davidic kings are king priests, right? And so there's a question as to whether the steward would have had priestly functions.
Yeah.
And many sources have said that the description of what the steward wears, a tunic, and I think is it a turban,
a girdle,
something like that he's described as, the girdle, this Jewish high priestly garb, is how the steward is dressed. What's interesting is commentary that, again, I apologize, I don't have it at my fingertips. They said Shebna is a type of Caiaphas, and that Eliakim is a type of Peter, right? So you have one false steward being replaced by the true steward, and the false steward is then kind of cut down, right? And I think there's that switch back and forth between Shebna and Eliakim, and some people are wondering if the later cutting down from the pig is a reference to Eliakim or to Shebna. Now, it could work either way, I think, with Peter, because he does fall from grace, so to speak, when he denies Christ. But there are some who argue that that's actually a turn back to Shebna back in Isaiah 22. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I know I've kind of taken things in a new direction.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. I love to know the source that compares Shebna to Caiaphas. That would actually be a perfect allusion, right? Because for anyone who's not familiar, in Isaiah 22:22, it describes God speaking through the prophet Isaiah, picking the successor to Shebna, who is going to be Eliakim. And Shebna was this corrupt secretary who is also serving as steward, and he's replaced by Eliakim. And Eliakim gets his tunic and girdle. And on page 16 of Roger David Oss's book, he explains that the tunic and the girdle gave the priest who wore it the power to forgive certain sins. So these would include, for the tunic, bloodshed; for the girdle, someone who is crooked in heart or thieves. And Shebna's task, according to Roland DeVoe in his book Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions, Shebna's function was to manage the temple tax, I believe. So that's why he'd wear the girdle. So it's fascinating then that Eliakim gets this particular power. Clearly, the position is a priestly one as well as a political one, so to speak, confirming kind of what Daniel was saying. But so I wanted to make a few more points, then we can move on. So when we talk about Peter being the chief priest in Matthew's gospel, I wonder where this is actually. Anyway, in Matthew's gospel, when he gives the list of the names of the apostles, in Greek it says first Simon, who was named Peter or Cephas. It says the word first there in Matthew's gospel is protos. And protos does not mean first on the list. You know, it could possibly mean first in a sequential sense, right? But even D.A. Carson, I think it's D.A. Carson, he says, yeah, but that's not what it means. Or it's D.A. Carson, R.T. France, and someone else, or even Craig S. Keener notes this. But protos means first in importance. It can be translated as principal or chief. So if you read Matthew's gospel literally, when it says protos first, you know, Simon Peter, it could be chief and the chief, Simon Peter, right, among the apostles. And scholars recognize that this attributes a kind of primacy to Peter. Craig S. Keener mentions this in his New Testament commentary. You know, it's known throughout that this is, you know, a pretty solid source of evidence for the primacy of Peter, at least. With that being said, yeah, I think I've said all that I need to say. But yeah, there's a lot of promising ground in this thesis that you've been proposing.
Well, there's a lot more to go too. So let's delve in further.
All right.
You know, I said I try to keep it to an hour, but I'm going to go give as much as I can. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so if you want to hit like 90 minutes, it's okay. Yeah.
We'll try to keep it to that.
Yeah.
So here, what I found is that really this theory starts to take off in the 19th century among actually a lot of non-Catholic sources that I found, primarily German and Lutheran and Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian exegetes. But the first source chronologically that I found, and I tried to order these chronologically, is Archbishop Richard Chenevieux Trench. Sorry, I probably butchered that. And probably somebody who really knows this guy is like, wow, you butchered that. But anyways, I want to quote the passage. This is from Unconscious Prophecies, where he's actually reflecting on how Caiaphas did give prophecy, right? He talks about the death of Christ, effectively, and how, you know, so that's in John 11. And this is a quote, and in the typical rehearsals of the crowning catastrophe in the drama of God's providence, how many a Nimrod, Pharaoh, Antiochus, and Nero, Antichrist, that do not quite come to the birth, have prophetic parts allotted to them, which they play out, unknowing what they do. We have another example of this in the very name Caiaphas, which is another form of Cephas. But the perplexing circumstance is the attribution to him because he was the high priest of these prophetic words. So Trench, Archbishop Trench, an Anglican archbishop, just off the cuff says Caiaphas is another form of Cephas, and he was speaking prophecy. He was the high priest. So this kind of confirms that. Again, I'm going to go through several sources as I can. The next source that I have is C.I. Black. This is from 1855, Messiahs and Anti-Messiahs. And this is an anti-Catholic polemic, which is interesting. He says that Caiaphas and Caiaphas are forms of the same name and emphasizes the true and false chief bishop and the true and false foundation. He claims subsequent popes are types of Caiaphases rather than Cephases, right? So his whole point is to say that what happened to the popes is that they actually became Caiaphases again. But presumably that meant that Caiaphas was what? A chief bishop, right? Even this anti-Catholic, his argument kind of gives away the farm, right? I mean, it gives too much.
If you don't accept his prejudice, then you could switch it around and say subsequent popes are types of Cephas who are types of Caiaphas in a way, but Caiaphas is the redeemed Caiaphas.
Yeah, exactly. So that's 1855. Bishop Christopher Wadsworth is a Scottish Episcopal Church. Again, I'm trying to emphasize these aren't just Catholics, right? This is broad spectrum here. You're going to get all sorts of sources. We've already had Jewish sources from the early church. Here we have Scottish Episcopal Church. He says, he suggests that Cephas and Caiaphas come from the same root and argues for typological parallels between Peter and Caiaphas at the trial and in Acts, often cited as an expert in other commentaries. Let me see if I can actually read to you what Wordsworth says. if you don't mind, it'll just take a second for me to bring it up here. Oops, hold on a moment, see if I can. If I can't, I'll just move on.
And also, Daniel, while you're doing that, for the audience who are watching this video, you don't have to read everything word for word. That might save us some time. You can just kind of see the summary there of
Yeah.
the source, right? Yeah. But I see the point that you're making.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to summarize some, but these are the bigger, the more foundational ones. Wordsworth is one of them. So let me just read this really quickly. He said, in the earlier chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, we see Peter and John on one side and Caiaphas and Annas on the other. The former the representative of the Christian church, the latter of the Jewish hierarchy. There is a remarkable contrast between these two parties. He says this, may not Caiaphas and Caiaphas perhaps be the same root? And then he gives actually the spelling of Caiaphas. I'm going to actually argue that they're both spelled with a quad, not a kaf. At first, Caiaphas had quailed before Caiaphas, but now the Holy Spirit is given. Caiaphas cannot resist Caiaphas. The one falls, the other rises. The reason is because Caiaphas rejects the cornerstone and is bruised to pieces by it. Okay, so that's another source. Hengstenberg, I have to, this is another major one because he's quoted throughout in making this case. He's a sort of a major player in this theory as another one who supports this. And I'm going to read a little bit of this, and then let's see. And then I'll kind of move more broadly along. I kind of wanted to lay it down with some of the earlier figures, and see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Okay. This is from his commentary on the Gospel of John, written in 1865, volume 2. He says, and one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should perish not. That's the prophecy, right? The name of Caiaphas is the same as Cephas, the difference being merely that between Syriac and the Chaldean pronunciation. The same change of form is found in the names of the town Caiaphas, called by William of Tyre, which was probably a translation of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was only a surname. His proper name was Joseph. And then he quotes Josephus there. No doubt Joseph took the name Caiaphas when he entered on his office. It was, properly speaking, his official name. It designated the high priesthood as the rock on which the edifice of the theocracy rested. Caiaphas bore that name at the very time when Jesus gave it to the first of the apostles, the rock on which he built his church. It may therefore be assumed that the Lord had a polemical objective in giving Simon his new name, setting against the imaginary rock the true one. Consequently, the name Caiaphas was a declaration of war against the religion of the times and an announcement of a new building to be set up upon. So that's pretty amazing, I think. And the sources go on. J.J. Godbey quotes Hengstenberg's theory in his own work, The Timely Words. This is I think he's a Baptist. Hengstenberg, I think, is a Lutheran. So again, non-Catholic sources. Let's see, C.J. Ellicott, this is a commentary you can find online, notes that the names are variants meaning rock, and he draws out the parallels in Acts 4:3-8. That's where Cephas or Peter appears before Caiaphas with John, right? And so what you have is Peter and John and Cephas and Annas, right, as the two Jewish high priests. And John, the name John in the full name would have been Johannes, right? So basically it's two Annases, right, and two Caiaphases. In Acts. And Ellicott makes that point. He says that the names are parallel, right? They're the same. Now, what's interesting is Craig Keener, he doesn't think that this is a parallel moment. And you see this, I list this later on in my sources. He in his exegetical commentary, he argues against the contrastive play between Peter and John and Caiaphas and Annas on account of the fact that Luke failed to use the Aramaic Cephas. He used Peter instead. The implication, though, is telling. What Keener is suggesting is that the names are indeed very similar. And he even says so. The names sound similar. So had Caiaphas been used, then the author would have intended this sort of play. Well, that might be true for the author, but I think that the play there is literal. In other words, this is a historical event, and I think it is providentially God put Caiaphas and Johanan against Caiaphas and Annas to make a point, right? And maybe it's been lost to us that that's what that meant, but and Luke's writing to a different audience who wouldn't have been familiar with that wordplay anyway. So nonetheless, I think it's there. I think it's present. Let's see, and again, interrupt me if you want to interject and ask about things, or a lot of these are just similar, but I'll kind of start to get into some other aspects, right? The Scottish Presbyterian White Law says that the Gospel of John claims Caiaphas is Syriac, is the Syriac form, I think, of Caiaphas to signify his priestly office, and he cites Henstingberg for support. Farrar in 1891 says Caiaphas is another form of Cephas. Marcus Dodds in the Expositor's Greek Testament, in a footnote, just says Caiaphas equals Cephas, and he's cited actually in many places as an authority, right? F.J. Hort says that despite the spelling variations, Kaf and Quaff, Caiaphas is most likely the twin name to Cephas. And Hort is, I think he is an expert in Aramaic, because this is a thorn in the side of Nestle, who is another sort of expert on the language. And he says, actually, Nestle, who I mentioned earlier, he gets all hot and bothered over the fact that Hort says this. He says, how could Hort say this? So it's interesting. Hort comes out and says that they are named twins. And that's almost at the turn of the century, 20th century. Commentary according to the Gospel according to St. John by William Bruce. Bruce uses an allegorical interpretation of Annas and Caiaphas as the will and intellect, and notes that their names seem to mean mercy and rock, right? So how could Caiaphas mean rock, right? Well, we know that Cephas means rock. It would have connected them directly to their sacred office and typologically twinned them with John and Peter, okay? Leo Beck in Son Kepha, essentially Beck quotes Sulzbeck to the effect that Cephas is a well-known pun for rock on which the sanctuary will be built, and is even more transparent in the meaning that Caiaphas should replace that Caiaphas, Simon Peter, should replace the previous Cephas in whose hat the temple keys are hidden. Mm-hmm. This is a German scholar who's saying that it's a well-known pun, right? This is in 1906. Burkett says that Caiaphas and Cephas are name variants, and he's sort of an expert on the Syriac language. Let's see, what else do I have? I want to get to the kind of later stuff and talk about the sort of Aramaic argument that I want to make. So, yeah. So from the International Critical Commentary, the Aramaic name Cephas, perhaps the same as Caiaphas, is familiar in Paul, right? So again, this is another source that says it. In other words, what I'm saying is this is not like my crackpot theory, right? There's a lot of people Italian philosopher, somewhat controversial figure, Giovanni Papini, in Storia di Cristo. I think this was actually the book by which he returned to the Catholic faith. He has an interesting passage that I think is worth reading. So I wanted to spend a moment on that.
Yeah, and while you find that passage, I just want to say too that, someone in the audience might think this is a crackpot theory, right? But if you understand, like in, Hebrew Jewish culture, names were incredibly significant. I think John Walton even says something didn't exist unless it had a name. So names had a creative component to them that were fundamental to an identity, right? And that's why like name changes are so significant in the Bible, because you're literally changing that person to have a function, such as from Abram to Abraham. But also,
Right.
there's another point that I wanted to make. Oh, I mean, and then for instance, like take Yeshua, Jesus, and Joshua, right? Yeshua is considered a variant of Joshua, and you could make the typological argument that just as Moses had led the people to the promised land, but it was Joshua who finished the work, right? Christ is kind of like, Adam had kind of been the head of humanity, but then Christ is the one who completed what Adam had failed to do. So he was like a Joshua, so to speak, in a way. So you could make these kinds of typological connections. Yeah, but this is not a crackpot theory if you understand the language or even the scholarly sources that you're citing.
Right, right. So here's what Papini says. He says, Caiaphas's real name was Joseph. Caiaphas is a surname and is the same word as Cephas, Simon's surname, that is to say, rock. On that Friday morning dawn, the Son of Man was caught between these two rocks like a grain of wheat between two millstones. Simon Peter is the type of the timid friends who knew not how to save him. Joseph Peter, he calls him Joseph Peter, of his enemies, determined at any cost to destroy him. Between the denial of Simon and the hatred of Joseph, between the head of the church about to disappear and the head of the church just coming into existence, between those two rocks, Jesus was like wheat between the millstones. The Sanhedrin was already come together and was awaiting him. Together with Annas and Caiaphas, who presided, there were John, Alexander, and all the reeking scum of the upper classes. As a rule, the Sanhedrin was composed of 23 priests, 23 scribes, and 23 elders, and 2 presidents, in all 71. So, sort of interesting that there's 70 to 71 disciples, right, of Jesus, right? There's this parallel there. I'm sorry if I'm just being spitfire. There's so much, and that's what I kind of wanted to emphasize, that, there are lots of different scholars, biblical exegetes, who make this point. Reverend Professor James Moffat makes a paraphrastic comment in his commentary of the New Testament that Caiaphas is Cephas. J.H. Bernard, in a critical commentary on the Gospel of John, says that Cephas is perhaps the same as Caiaphas. So some are a little bit more measured. They kind of say, well, it's perhaps, or it could be, or may it be that, I'm not sure. Here's an interesting one, though. Frederick Busby, and this is in his dissertation on the Semitic background of the Synoptic Gospels, cites William Wright, 1890, the lectures on the comparative grammar of Semitic languages. Busby notes the theory that Caiaphas is a variation on Cephas and says that it's possible, given Wright's explanation, that Qaf and Kaf freely interchange across Semitic languages. In other words, you cannot say that because the first letters are different, that this is impossible, because between Syriac, Aramaic, and Hebrew, you could have that change, okay? Such spelling variations are found commonly, all right? So that's what I thought was very interesting evidence. This is also very interesting evidence. C.K. Barrett, in the Gospel according to St. John, cites the authority of Adolf Schlatter on an alternate spelling of Cephas in Galilean Aramaic, which is spelled Caiaphas, spelled the same as Caiaphas, okay, in the Hebrew script there. So if you go back to to the top, it would be identical to Caiaphas. So that I thought was fascinating. I have to track down Schlater to see that, what he's saying, but he's saying that, and it's interesting, this Galilean Aramaic, right? This would have been the Aramaic that that when Jesus and the disciples, when Peter went to Caiaphas's house, one of the women who were there, they said, "Hey, aren't you one of those, you're speaking that weird dialect," right? You're speaking that weird. So here's the thing, right? You have Jesus speaking, okay? And he says in his funny accent, okay, "I'm going to call you Caiaphas." And what happens? It gets written down in Hebrew. I mean, it gets written down in Greek, right? And transliterated into from the Greek back to Aramaic as Caiaphas, right? So we really have the Greek Caiaphas, but we don't know. What we don't know is what the real first letter would have been. No one knows what Jesus would have written down. Was it a Kof or a Kaf? Was it that sort of backwards C or that kind of squiggly one? We don't know.
But what you're saying is in the language itself, in that previous source, right? They are, or actually, it's in the Busby source, right? They could be interchangeable, right, across the Semitic
It
languages.
could be changed. Right. So one argument is that it's just simply. So some argue that they're just name variations, spelling differences between names, but they essentially mean the same thing. It's like Shimon and Simon or something. It's just like different ways of, or Simeon, right? They're kind of different variations on the same name, right? Just like, Pietro or Pedro or Peter. They're all just kind of, they're the same name, but in different dialects, different languages, right? So that's a possibility, right? Let's see, what else is going? So that's in Barrett. Now here we get into some more out there sources. I don't know if you're familiar with John Allegro, but he's kind of a mythicist. He makes a big deal about the connection between the names. He had this idea that Christianity was essentially an Essene psychedelic mushroom cult. Okay, now I throw this out there, my point in referencing him is to reference the wide variety of people who recognize this name connection. And there are some kind of more fringe scholars that do this, right? So Allegro is mentioned, Eisenman, Robert Eisenman, I mentioned him. I think he's a bit of a mythicist as well. And he says that they're name variants as well, and that there's very little difference in the cursive writing at the time between the two names in Aramaic. So it would be hard to really distinguish the names, even visually. Let's see, there are a couple of French Jesuit priests who wrote that the names are orthographically similar and intended to show that Simon is the new high priest. That was written about in 1980. Ford Forberg argues that Peter is the high priest of the new covenant, says the Caiaphas may have been chosen owing to the similarity to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time. And then here's a name that's familiar to probably the audience. Scott Hahn, in an audio lecture that I found, talks about the typology between Caiaphas and Caiaphas and the name similarity in an audio speech on the One Holy Church. I'd love to get his feedback on all of this, because he just sort of alludes to the name similarity, but doesn't really get into the possibility that they are indeed the same name, right, as variants. H.E. Will says that one is this, that's Caiaphas is a Syriac form of Caiaphas. Let's see, who else? Robert Price, who you might know as a mythicist. He says that Caiaphas and Caiaphas are typological doubles, and that the names are strikingly similar. The parallels, he says, are obvious. A popularizer, D. James Kennedy, he promotes this theory that they're the same name. Um, A.J.M. Wenberg says that, quote, and if Ebner were correct in seeing Peter's nickname Caiaphas as a counterbalance or counterblast name Caiaphas, then this too would be a counter to the temple or aristocracy, not to the temple itself. We talked about Keener. And lastly, these two, I can mention Brant Petrie is another name that the audience might be familiar with, the noted Catholic scholar. Notes in, again, this was an audio, a lecture that I found. He mentions the parallel between Simon Caiaphas and Caiaphas in the interrogation that I mentioned at the beginning, right? One says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And the other asks, in the name of the living God, are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God? And Petrie says that they are type, anti-type, and notes the name similarity as well. And then this was one of the most interesting finds I found, and this is sort of the last point, is J.F. Hulton, okay? In What's in a Name, the use of Simon Peter in 2 Peter 1:1, he says, according to his analysis, he says the Galilean Aramaic for Cephas, and that's the Greek spelling, would have been with the quote. Hulton says with the kaf, or the kof, I should say, not the quote, kof, with the kaf. Hulton says with the kaf, it would have been transcribed at a chi, not with a kappa. Thus, we have very recent scholarship in 2013 that stands in line with the long tradition of saying that Simon was renamed after the only other person in Judea with the name at the time, who happened to be the high priest of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so if Hulton is right, and this is the direction I would go, Jesus renamed Simon with the quof, not with the kaf, right? With that the squiggle kind of instead of the backward C. And so what we would say then is that he literally had the same name, but pronounced with a Galilean twang, okay? And perhaps differently from how Caiaphas would have said his own name. Hence, there are some, vowel changes, right? Between the two, but perhaps even the very first letter would have been the same.
All right, Daniel, I want to do two things real quick before we wrap up this episode. One is just to perhaps just engage a potential objection, and then the second is to summarize the case. So typically I've heard it made by someone like Steve Bray, that the reason why Simon gets the name, Peter, is because in Caesarea Philippi, there's a giant rock that I believe Philip the Tetrarch, who is the son of Herod the Great, dedicates to Caesar. Right, so there's this giant rock here, and the reason why Peter is given the name Peter is because of this rock, and it's showing that Peter is standing against the pagan powers. Right, so that's an objection that someone could raise, but I just want to answer it, right? Because I don't see why it can't be both, right? Why it can't both be Cephas is the rock of the church, right? And people will say, oh, well, there's the Petra difference. D.A. Carson blows that out the water. Craig Keener blows that out the water. A lot of people have messaged me like they were surprised that they didn't know the scholarly consensus is that Peter is the rock of the church, not his confession, but the person. But anyway, so you could have Peter, the rock of the church, standing against the pagan powers in Caesarea Philippi, and you can also have Peter, the rock, standing Caiaphas in opposition to Caiaphas, right, in Jerusalem. So basically, you can have this twofold kind of message on what the meaning of Peter's name is. So that's not really an objection. So, Daniel, I want to ask you this. When we place this in our arsenal in the case for the papacy, what exactly does this get us? Because obviously, do you think it's going to get us the entire, he's the Bishop of Rome, he's got successors. What does this get us, Daniel, in the end?
I think that this gives us a strong reason to think that the early disciples and apostles of Christ would have recognized Peter as the high priest of the new Sanhedrin. And therefore, that he held special authority and power. And then I would turn around and look around at all the Christian churches today and see which one has that tradition today, right? Has a real understanding. Yes, there are other members of the Sanhedrin, right? Other leaders. But why is it that in the Jewish hierarchy of the Sanhedrin, why would there be a chief priest, a high priest on earth? And then in the new Sanhedrin of the apostles, it's just a sort of collective of equals. Now, I know some are going to look at Hebrews, right, and say, well, Jesus is the new high priest. And, that dangerous Catholic both and, right? Jesus is the rock, so Peter's not the rock. Well, that's not a valid inference, right? Jesus is the high priest, so Peter's not the high priest. It is through Jesus that Peter is able to be the high priest, just like it is through David that that the steward is able to be a high priest too, right? So Eliakim, the Davidic kingship's able to have a priestly role. And so I would say, yes, it's not a slam dunk, deductively certain, logically necessary inference that these name variants directly entail the truth of the Catholic Church. As I noted, there are anti-Catholics, there are mythicists, there are Jews, there are Presbyterians, Anglicans, Lutherans, who all agree to this name connection, but they don't draw the inference.
Yeah.
But my question is, what best explains Christ's renaming Peter this? What would it have meant to Peter that he's got the same name as Caiaphas? Like, Jesus literally goes up to him and says, hi, I'm calling you my new Caiaphas. Wouldn't Peter and all the disciples have said, oh, well, you mean like that guy?
Yeah.
Over in Jerusalem? Is that what you're calling me? Him? Are you saying I'm the chief priest? Because that's what it sounds like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I want to go back for a second, and this is sort of more idle speculation maybe on my part. But why does Jesus say, you have said so, when Caiaphas says to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.
Oh, yeah.
You have said so. Idle speculation on my part. Caiaphas has said so. Who has said so? Peter said so. We know Peter said so. Peter said so in 1616. Jesus is saying, you, the Caiaphas, has said so. But he's really meaning the guy lurking in the room, in the back halls, out in the courtyard, who's peering in, looking in. He said so, right? Because that is the true Caiaphas.
And Daniel, Christ says here, but I tell you, and then he goes on with his sentence there. And then if you look up here, Christ says, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock, and so forth, right? So even there, the structure repeats itself in another place. And I tell you, but I tell you. Wow.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very, to me, that illuminates that passage, right? Because he's sort of saying, look, I already told the Caiaphas, right? Or the Caiaphas has already confessed this. I'm talking to you, the Caiaphas, but you're kind of like the sham version of of the person who's already confessed this. And then he turns around, and by saying you've blasphemed, he's kind of cutting himself off from that role, right? And that's why I think that's why they see Caiaphas as the last to occupy the seat of Moses, and Simon Caiaphas, to be the first to occupy the seat of Moses, the chair of Peter.
There's another thing I want to say too, which is that you mentioned how it is, like it's not in conflict for Peter to be the rock and for Christ to be the cornerstone, or for Christ to be the high priest and for Peter to be the high priest, right? Because it is through Christ, that Peter is the high priest, is the vicar of Christ, right? Or even when Jesus says, call no man father, and then Paul says in his, I think it's in Corinthians or somewhere, and I have become a father to you through Jesus Christ, right? So none of these things are legitimate unless they are done through Jesus Christ. So that's one way to avoid the
Right.
objection. But if I can also add, Daniel, so
We are the body of Christ. Yeah.
right, I think this gets you. I think this gets you close to. This gets you primacy, of course. I know that based on the high priest, the function of the high priest, he didn't act alone. He didn't have a universal jurisdiction or kind of like this sole power. However, in John 11:52, it says that when Caiaphas had served as high priest that year, he had received revelation that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God, or something like that, and that Jesus would die for the sins of the world and unite the children of Israel. So Caiaphas receives divine revelation despite the fact, or is illumined by God, despite the fact that he is not a good man, right? So despite of his character flaws, he still receives prophecy and revelation from God. And it is to him alone when he had served as high priest of that year. So this could give some credence to an argument for papal infallibility. Let's see here. There's infallibility, succession.
Even in the face of, even in the face of the Pope being morally dubious, right? So what is it? The Donatists who argue that the priests have to be impeccable, and if they sin, then they forfeit their holy office effectively, and their charisms, right? So am I getting that right? Yeah, I think it's
the Donatists. Yeah.
So you even and that's the verse, right? John 11, where they talk where Caiaphas is giving prophecy. They say, "Oh, look at that! If he can do it, so could the Pope, right? So can the bishops, right?" There is that connection between the two in that controversy itself. Yeah, and I think that tells that there again, if the high priest is receiving revelation, as you said, of the old covenant, then wouldn't it be all the more a fortiori in the new covenant that the leaders of our church, the new Sanhedrin, be guided by God's revelation, right?
Right.
I say, yeah, okay, that ends with Peter, but does it? And that's where you have to make arguments,
right?
For the transfer of office, which you can get in Acts, right? With the transfer of Judas's office, right? As you know.
Yeah, right. And like the office of high priest is successional, so it is handed down to successors. Let's see here.
It's true.
Yeah, I mean, and if
that's the thing. I was going to say, at the time, the way in which the high priest was being selected broke with Jewish law, right? So you already were having corruption at that point, where it was the Romans who were essentially putting in their guys. And that's why you have some question as to whether Annas or Caiaphas was it the father-in-law or the son-in-law who was the high priest. There was ambiguity, and they were both kind of functioning. It seems partly because one was put in and then the other was installed by the Romans in breaking with Jewish tradition, that once you're installed, it's really a lifetime appointment. And so they actually take Jesus first to the house of Annas, and he's like, well, I don't know what to do. Send him to my son-in-law, effectively. But they didn't even know who was the high priest, really. So you can see it was already fracturing up at that point.
Yeah. And if I can just add one thing too, it seems to me that when we look back on the ancient scriptures and we reflect on their meaning, when we get closer to what Christ intended or what he said, we realize that if you think about my Bible's like, over there or somewhere else. But anyway, like if you look at the Bible, right, we have so much in the Old Testament, thousands of years of history. And then in the Gospels, we have the 3-year ministry of Christ just dropping an utter bomb on the entire narrative in a way. And, and in this very relatively quick fashion, he is, he is the new David, the new Moses, the new Adam. He is fulfilling the covenants of God and his forefathers. Christ is doing so much. He's establishing a new Sanhedrin. He is, as the new Moses, establishing a new court, and so on and so forth. It seems to me the case that, and even Roger David Oss makes this point in his book, that a lot of these points would have been lost when the church became more kind of appealing to Gentiles, right? A lot of these Jewish elements might have been missing, but they would have been preserved without exactly us knowing, why do we hold this as part of the tradition necessarily, right? Because there's just so much that Christ dropped in 3 years that it would probably take time to develop and for people to realize, wait, where did this come from?
Yeah. That's why I kind of want to look at the Syriac fathers.
Yeah.
See those speaking Aramaic, see how they were understanding it. And that's why I think it's funny when I do find the connections between Caiaphas and Caiaphas. It's typically, the Syriac and Egyptian fathers who would have had more Semitic roots in their language. But there is also some reason why you wouldn't necessarily want to connect Peter too much to Caiaphas, right? He's seen as one of the enemies of Christ, and you don't want to say, oh, well, this is the new Caiaphas, right? This is the new enemy of something could be, it's almost sarcastic. I mean, is it sinful to be sarcastic if Jesus was being sarcastic in naming Peter, right? There's a sense of polemical, right? That's what Hengstenberg said. It was polemical. It's a little bit of a barb, right? So to make that connection throughout the history of the church might have been a bit iffy as an apologetic. But I think today it's time to look back at that and say, well, is there some reason? And what I'm seeing is, in terms of the case, there's a lot of good scholarship that suggests they are the same name. There's a lot of good history that suggests it's the same name. There are some who say it's the different roots, different names. Okay, that's to be granted. But I see it mostly resting on the authority of Nestle, as I said. And he was, as I said, dismayed at court who disagreed with him. So you have some scholars on both sides of this issue. And what I would say is, take that plus the typology, the scriptural parallels are just there. I really think that there's good reason to say that. Now, again, my faith as a Catholic doesn't stand or fall on this.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying it's like absolutely slam dunk case. I'm just saying, this is really interesting. This is good inductive reason, right? To increase the probability. If we were doing a Bayesian analysis, right? I put this in there and that might tick the evidence clock a little bit higher towards a case for the papacy. Certainly, now, I don't think this alone would make the case for the papacy more likely than not, but put together with other work, other arguments, I think you have a fairly strong case. So again, I think your work that you're working on the papacy would be something that this could be married to and to add to in terms of the case.
Yeah, I mean, it fills in a lot of gaps or some things that I wish I had, a better way of filling in, and this is a very natural way to do it. But yeah, Daniel, I just want to thank you for coming on to my show. You've listed 41 sources in defense of your thesis. I think it's very promising. I'd love to collaborate with you and help, fill in any pieces that you need or any sources from any books that I have, anything I can do to help you out in this area. And Daniel, thank you for this research that you've done and the rigor by which you presented it. If I could say just a few last things, right? Because this is an area that I love studying. When it came to the polemical point about Caiaphas and Cephas, right? We know based on the history, what the scholars recognize on the composition of Matthew's gospel, that it was written during a time in which Christians and Jews were in conflict, and they would have been intentionally polemic. So, I mean, Matthew's gospel fits within that community's narrative and understanding of itself. It probabilifies the polemical argument and enhances the contrast. Let's see here. And then also when it comes to the function of the high priest, so the high priest would offer the Right of Atonement. So He would forgive the sins of all of Israel by sacrificing the lamb. We see that Christ is the high priest and he is the Lamb of God. And the high priest also, obviously did have the power to forgive sins. So if we have binding and loosing being given to Peter, then that also plays a part in probabilifying him being a high priest of sorts. Let's see. And then I was wondering, I think there was also a way in which the high priest was kind of like a final authority when it came to forgiving sins. I think it was something like, I don't remember exactly, but I have to look into this more. But yeah, there's definitely a sense in which the high priest had a uniqueness of authority, but I need to study that again. Yeah. But Daniel, thank you so
Well,
much.
there's that idea. Let me just say
Yeah,
that
yeah.
there's this idea that what you bind and loose on earth is bound and loose in heaven.
Mhm.
In other words, he's with the authority of heaven. Heaven is in harmony, right, with what is being done on earth, right?
Mhm.
And that is a strong claim, right? That's a strong claim of power.
Yeah, and I mean, like,
Find-
in my own research on, on this point, Craig S. Keener mentions how the Jews believe that the high court of Moses, which is the throne of Moses found with the Pharisees and Sadducees, their decisions were confirmed by God's tribunal in heaven. So when Christ says, "Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven," he's also taking another jab at the Pharisees by saying, "Oh, you think your decisions are bound in heaven, right? But guess what? My apostles, my rabbis, my high court now has that power because I'm the new Moses. I determine who has the seat now." So yeah, that's beautiful. Daniel, thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much.